broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the webinar from the Mayor's Innovation Project on leveraging private capital for Great Lakes green infrastructure implementation in cooperation with American Rivers and Corona Environmental Consulting. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Satya Rhodes Conway. I'm the Mayor's Innovation Project Managing Director. We're going to wait just a moment more for folks to get on the line. I see people are actively joining now. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. So while we're waiting, let me just let folks know that we are going to have probably about half an hour-ish of presentation, and then we will have some time for questions or discussion at the end. And if you have questions along the way, please go ahead and type them into the question box, and we will save those up and ask them at the end. If you have notes or logistics issues, you can use the chat box. And I will let you know that we are recording this, and we will have it posted on our website at mayorsinnovation.org after, give us a couple days to process it, and then it'll be up on our website and available for folks to review later. And I believe that we will be able to make the slide deck available as well, but if nothing else, you'll have the recording of it. So we still have folks joining us. I'm just going to wait a moment more. If you've just joined us, my name is Satya Rhodes Conway. I'm the Managing Director of the Mayor's Innovation Project, and I'm happy to be hosting this webinar today with American Rivers and Corona Environmental Consulting on leveraging private capital for green infrastructure implementation. And just give it a moment more before we get started. Again, if you have questions along the way, please enter them into the question box in the webinar dashboard. We'll save those up for the end and answer them then. If you have any issues, you can message me or one of the other staff in the chat box, and we can try and troubleshoot along the way. We are recording the webinar, and it will be posted on our website at mayorsinnovation.org. Okay, and it looks like we have a good number of folks that have joined. So I think we will go ahead and get started. And so again, I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Satya Rhodes Conway. I'm the Managing Director of the Mayor's Innovation Project. And I'm very pleased to be presenting this webinar today on leveraging private capital for Great Lakes green infrastructure implementation. And I want to welcome and thank Jeff Odefey of American Rivers and Janet Clements from Corona Environmental Consulting, who are our presenters today. We at the Mayor's Innovation Project have a long-standing, very positive collaborative relationship with American Rivers, and very pleased to be able to share some of the work that we've done, that they have done with you today. And then without further ado, I think I'm just going to hand it over to Jeff, who is going to start our presentation.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I gather there are some more dramatic viewing opportunities or programming you might be drawn to today, but appreciate your time with us. Janet, Clements, and I are going to spend some time walking through a bit of a survey, or I guess an exploration of two of the financing projects that we have underway. Let's start with some introductions. I'm Jeff Odefey. I work for American Rivers in our Clean Water Supply Program, which focuses on urban water infrastructure issues and urban water issues around the country. I'm based in an office in Nevada City, California, but like Janet, I get to travel around the country and enjoy partnerships with a diverse range of municipal agencies and stakeholders. Janet, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Janet Clements. I am with a company called Corona Environmental Consulting out of You're in the Denver, Colorado area. I am a water resource economist. I do a lot of work in stormwater, and for the past several years have been working a lot in stormwater management and green infrastructure on funding, financing, green infrastructure incentives, and also looking at the benefits and co-benefits of green infrastructure.
A little bit of background. Along with Corona and our partners at the Water Environment Federation, we formed a partnership that we're calling the Stormwater Currency Project. And the goal here is, again, to work with communities in developing and designing local stormwater funding strategies. We do have 2 projects currently underway, supported by the Great Lakes Protection Fund. It enables us to work with some terrific on-the-ground partners at the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District and Metro Cleveland, and the Environmental Services Department, the City of Grand Rapids. Now, those are 2 totally different types of cities. They're smaller scale or different scales from each other, and they have different funding scenarios and different stormwater challenges, so they're nice laboratories for us. We want to talk to you today about our work with them to design and roll out some locally tailored green infrastructure funding programs. But our second goal is really to develop models that other communities can follow. So we're interested in your feedback and your questions. We invite you to reach out to us and participate in our work if either of these approaches seem relevant to you. So a couple of maybe process notes. As Sachi indicated, I'm going to get us started, but then Janet and I are going to hand the mic back and forth. So you'll get used to hearing both of our voices in turn. And also, we can't help it. We revert to acronyms out of habit. So you may hear us use GSI. That's our new fancy shorthand for green stormwater infrastructure. Some of you may have adopted that. It's just another way of phrasing it. So let's jump in, so we can find the button. I guess it's becoming a little bit of a cliche or a truism that stormwater is seen as both a problem and a resource. So in order to be successful at responding to both of those, we recognize that municipalities require a sustainable source of funding, both for individual projects and for your comprehensive municipal management programs. So we want to talk about 2 stormwater funding options that we see as enabling public agencies to address the problems while taking advantage of stormwater as a resource. But I'm going to back us up a little bit higher level. We're often talking to engineers and program managers who are rightly focused on permit compliance and the technicalities of BMP specifications. But today we should think a little bit more expansively for this conversation about what the objectives of a stormwater program can be. I want to suggest that you think broadly about how your local efforts can do more than just deliver regulatory compliance, and that your programs can help value the flexibility and benefits that come with green infrastructure, the multiple benefits. And programs can be a way to appreciate the green infrastructure programs, projects can engage with the community more inclusively, taking advantage of skills, networks, and resources that you have out in the broader community. And also be an opportunity to share resources and capabilities within your municipal government structure across agencies rather than working in a single silo. I'm a little trouble with the slides here. All right. With all this in mind, it might be helpful just to suggest a structure that Janet and I will try to follow or reframe our presentation through. We're going to place our discussion in the context of how these 2 programs we're working on can meet the 4 challenges that we think of as being common to all stormwater programs. Obviously, there's an economic challenge, right? There's just never enough money in public budgets to address all of your stormwater needs. And not only that, the costs of stormwater impacts are often borne outside of the agency. They're external to the government structure and are picked up by the community in terms of flood damages or public health impacts. There are obviously some environmental issues that are associated with stormwater programs. Stormwater permits are becoming more stringent. Water quality implications are more pressing. And there are the obvious and real environmental harms like habitat loss and water quality impairment that go along with stormwater impacts. Stormwater certainly affects communities through flooding and flood damages, but there are also inequities that are the way, that stem from the way stormwater infrastructure investments are distributed across the communities, often to the exclusion of key constituencies. And climate change is, I think, something we can agree on is real. Future conditions are uncertain as patterns of precipitation and frequency change. So agencies and property developers and community associations need to plan for rain events and patterns that are unlikely to be completely predictable based on past behavior. Adapting to climate changes require us to do things differently. So why is this all important? It seems to us that in order to be affordable and effective and supported by ratepayers and taxpayers, stormwater solutions need to address all four of these, not just provide single source solutions. So we believe that the approaches that we're developing achieve this. We think that it's possible to increase the funds that are available to build green infrastructure and to sustain programs by bringing in private sector and alternative financing approaches. We think the more green infrastructure built through these approaches will increase the pollution control and the community resiliency throughout our locations, providing more volume, targeting stormwater investments in priority neighborhoods. I think that these structures will help you or help our partners engage broadly across their communities, including businesses, faith-based associations, neighborhood groups. And the future conditions will be met more successfully through multiple, diverse, resilient green infrastructure solutions. Janet, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you. Next slide. Well, as Jeff said, we are working in two Great Lakes communities, communities in Northeast Ohio, as well as in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And we're implementing specific strategies in those communities to help address the challenges that Jeff just went over. Before we kind of dive into the details of those specific programs and projects, I wanted to back up and kind of present the range of new and innovative solutions that are being explored as ways to fund or finance green infrastructure and stormwater management throughout communities in the United States. So these approaches range from alternative compliance and incentive-based programs through to more true kind of financing mechanisms like environmental impact bonds and public-private partnerships. Now, today, again, we are going to be talking about two specific types of programs, and that includes stormwater credit trading and a green infrastructure grant program. We'd be happy to follow up with you at any time. Please feel free to reach out to us to talk, talk more about these other approaches and assess what may or may not work in your community. Next slide. So with that, I will dive into some of the basics associated with one of the solutions we'll be talking about today, which is stormwater credit trading. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, the basics of stormwater credit trading is basically it allows property owners or developers who are subject to stormwater management requirements, so requirements associated most commonly with community MS4 permits that have post-construction stormwater runoff requirements. It allows those developers and property owners to meet part of their stormwater management requirements off-site. And the way they do that is that they purchase what we call volume-based stormwater credits from other property owners. So as in any market, so we call stormwater credit trading, we call it a market-based approach. As in any market, you have buyers and sellers. So again, on the buyer side, you have people who are, developers, property owners who are looking to meet a portion of their stormwater management requirements off-site. And then you have sellers who are property owners, most commonly who are probably property owners who voluntarily implement green infrastructure practices and then sell the, the volume that those practices manage as green infrastructure-based stormwater credits. Sellers can also include developers, property owners that go above and beyond what they're required to do. So people who have new or redevelopment sites who must meet stormwater management requirements, going beyond that and then selling that extra capacity. There's a couple of important, I think, benefits to mention here. A market is only going to function if the buyers can benefit from participating in it as well as the sellers. In this case, a buyer can benefit from, maybe it's cheaper and easier to purchase stormwater credits offsite than it is to implement stormwater management controls onsite. So it gives them a little bit of flexibility. Obviously, sellers can benefit if they profit from selling these credits, but the community as a whole can also benefit because if designed correctly, a stormwater credit trading market can result in more green infrastructure, more distributed green infrastructure than would otherwise be implemented in areas where it's needed most. Next slide. So I should mention here, there's only one, as far as we know, functioning stormwater credit trading market in the United States, and that is in Washington, D.C. So full credit goes to the D.C. Department of Energy and Environment for, they pioneered this approach, they developed kind of the concept, and they've brought it through and implemented it. Their market has been functioning for several years. So what we're doing is we're taking DC's model and thinking about and evaluating whether it can apply in different areas. Right now, we're working with Grand Rapids, Michigan, to evaluate the potential for a credit trading program. Now, Grand Rapids is obviously a little bit different than DC. It's a mid-sized urban area located in the Midwest, but it does have a pretty substantial rate of development and redevelopment, which is one of the kind of preconditions for having a credit trading market. The city of Grand Rapids, their environmental services division, does not have a separate stormwater utility or a dedicated stormwater fee. They manage the sewer and stormwater utility is one. The city is currently, this is important to mention, the city is currently waiting its new kind of revised MS4 permit from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. And that's important because the draft permit, as it's written, opens up some opportunities that make it possible for credit trading to take place. The first is that it introduces some new, as it's written, again, it is in draft form, but as it's written, it introduces new standards for new development and redevelopment sites, and they are retention standards. So that means new development and redevelopment sites of a certain size have to retain stormwater on site. And green infrastructure is the preferred way of meeting those standards. The permit also allows for some off-site compliance. So this is where credit trading enters. So next slide, please. So there's a lot of details, and when you start digging in, there's a lot of details about how to design a credit trading program, what conditions have to be in place. So I'll touch on just 4 of some of the bigger issues that we've wrestled through, and then I'll pass it back to Jeff to talk a little bit more about some specific Grand Rapids conditions and what, some questions that we have about what's going to make the program work there. Like any market, the key to having it function properly is really balancing supply and demand. So these 4 bullets here kind of speak to that. And as I go through them, you'll see how they kind of help to do that in different ways. So the first key question that comes to mind and concern perhaps when people think about setting up a credit trading market is to ensure that it doesn't result in any adverse water quality impacts. So if you think about it, if there's a development site in watershed A and they're purchasing, they're meeting their compliance by purchasing credits in watershed X, those two may not be located close to each other. So there's a potential there for maybe, if you're taking away stormwater management controls, are there any adverse impacts in that watershed? In Grand Rapids, we've accounted for that by kind of dividing the city into 3 different trading areas to ensure that, dislocating the site where the development is from the credit generation does not result in water quality impacts. Now in DC, they have a different situation where a different hydrologic system where they're allowed to trade across all watersheds within the city because they know that it will actually, where the credit generation is taking place, will actually improve overall water quality. So it is something specific to each community. Another aspect of putting a program together is ensuring that there's enough demand. And that speaks to that second bullet at looking at, what are the conditions that favor offsite compliance? Are people actually going to want to go offsite and purchase credits? It's kind of key to the market functioning. There's a couple things that will make that happen. It has to be cheaper and easier for people to purchase credits than to implement stormwater management on site. Going off-site may also result in other economic benefits for a developer. They may free up some additional buildable area on their site, so they get kind of an economic gain. In DC, all developers, property owners subject to stormwater management requirements can meet half of their requirements off-site. So they have to meet 50% on-site if they can, and then they can go off-site to meet the second half. In Grand Rapids, there's some additional restrictions about whether you can go off-site based on the feasibility of retaining water on the development site. Even with those restrictions in place, we think there's enough demand in the market within our 3 trading areas to support, a functioning market. 2 additional items just to think about is, and something we're kind of thinking through as we design the program is ensuring there's enough demand when the market starts. This is something that often the agency who's in charge of the program can help start. So in Grand Rapids, we're looking at how the city can provide an initial kind of stash of credits based on the green infrastructure projects that they've already developed, kind of that go beyond their permit obligations. In DC, they grandfathered voluntary green infrastructure projects implemented, in the private sector, and allowed people who had done projects before the market started up to sell them as credits. This helps to, ensure that there's enough supply. Other ways are to keep the market kind of going, or to, provide grants, or to help, and Jeff will speak a little more to this, but to provide grants or guarantee a purchase of credits from credit generators. So kind of keeping ensure that supply is in place. And finally, another aspect of program design is, again, kind of creating certainty in the market, and that also helps to balance supply and demand. So bounding the market. On the supply side, what they do in DC is they have a price lock guarantee program. So they say, if you generate credits and you can't sell them on the market, you can enter into an agreement with us and we'll buy them at a set price. It'll probably be lower than what you can get on the market, but it doesn't help to ensure a supply. And on the other end, developers want to be sure that prices of credits aren't going to increase exponentially. So what DC does, and what we're recommending in Grand Rapids, is that they will have an option to buy credits on the market, or through an in lieu fee, pay the city to, instead of implementing all their controls on site, pay the city what we call an in lieu fee. And the city will use that money to turn around and build green infrastructure projects, with the idea that will kind of set a ceiling price in the market, because it's typically more expensive for the city to implement green infrastructure projects than it is for a private sector, someone who's entering the market and selling it as credits. Next slide.
Thanks, Janet. As Janet mentioned, we've been really kind of iterating off of the DC pioneering model. So as we've thought about adapting it to Grand Rapids, we've run up against some new issues. One of which is, how can we consider ways that the market can be designed to gently direct trading to build green infrastructure in priority neighborhoods or subwatersheds, rather than just letting the free market dictate where credit generating green infrastructure is installed. So ideas we're starting to model out include tailoring the credit trading ratios, if that's potential, to reflect geographic or watershed preferences. So there are some trading ratios that are set in the draft permit. We're examining how those will play out in a local scenario, but also thinking about future changes that may be possible down the road to adapt those credit trading ratios in the local conditions. Also, is it possible to line up subsidies or grants, either from the city or from other entities, to community groups or NGOs or contractors who can build credits in high priority areas or watersheds? And we're also considering ways to restrict the trading geographies. Janet mentioned we have 3 subwatersheds that are their own private markets, but trading can be directional as well. You can have one-way trades that are allowed, where credits can be purchased from one watershed, but not have trades go the other way. And that can really emphasize green infrastructure location in priority watersheds. So another expectation of a credit trading program, the way it functions, is that it'll be cheaper to build green infrastructure in neighborhoods with lower property values. But this can have, we have to recognize also that this can have some adverse impacts. And green infrastructure is one of those factors that's associated with increases in gentrification, with negative consequences like tax-based increases and possible displacement. So the take home from that is a green infrastructure or a stormwater credit trading program can't exist in isolation. The city and other partners have to join those with other policies or programs that are directed towards neighborhood affordability to mitigate economic impacts. We're exploring whether credit trading can provide economic signals or triggers for those additional public benefits that we associate with green infrastructure. Can price incentives reflect the value of additional services? So for example, if we're building street trees as part of a credit generating green infrastructure project, is there a way to capture the value of meeting urban shade requirements or shade policy goals? So Janet has talked a little bit about the in lieu fee and feasibility conditions that we met in Grand Rapids. And the real lesson there is that it's important in your conversations with the regulatory agency to get the permit language right up front. The payment in lieu fee, for example, in Grand Rapids is calculated on a case-by-case basis. Well, that doesn't really provide certainty for the project developer. They're never going to know whether the in lieu fee is more or less than an offsite credit purchase may be. Same is true in some ways for feasibility conditions. You know, how if projects can only go offsite if it's infeasible, technically infeasible to stay on site or some portion on site, then you know, it acts to kind of restrict the participation in the market. It constrains the size of the market, as does kind of restrictions within trade within watersheds. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. So one thing that is, I guess, kind of attractive about a stormwater credit trading program is the role of the private sector. Right? You have developers or neighborhood associations building and buying credits that are generated without the direct handholding engagement of the public agency. That doesn't mean that the agency gets to take a total backseat. So there are continuing roles, including administrative burdens and costs that are associated with running a program. Janet mentioned the purchase guarantee program, which obviously requires an infusion of public funding. It may be possible to use a developer certification program, maybe attractive to do that to ensure that credit generating practices are properly designed and constructed. So there'll be an urban role or a municipal role in running that kind of program. We talked a little bit about how the agency may want to intervene to ensure that green infrastructure investments hit priority neighborhoods or areas of special concern. And those interventions can be funding, or they can be more soft interventions like permit streamlining, things like that. The initial supply of credits is really important. We want to make sure that the market has enough capital to function as it gets going. So Grand Rapids has previously constructed a supply of green infrastructure projects. There's also the potential to build in credits from that are built by community organizations or private sector, you know, before a kind of a grandfathered date. So we want to look at that. And I mentioned a little bit the incentives we can use to jumpstart the market. Outreach to third-party aggregators may be one of those who are able to deliver kind of upfront funding and financing. So how does a credit trading program kind of meet those four challenges we lined up at the beginning, right? So it's definitely an opportunity to bring publicly funded green infrastructure into an overall public portfolio, to provide those benefits that, that reach out into the community. Certainly there's additional treatment that comes online, enabling a municipal agency to meet its permit needs. The community gets involved by building green infrastructure, particularly through neighborhood associations or community groups. And there's a real engagement opportunity. And finally, you know, a program like this stands the opportunity of building a greater supply of green infrastructure, more distributed more broadly, and creating resiliency across the specific space. We could talk about this all day, Janet. Well, let's talk about a grant program. So as we move from Grand Rapids over to Metro Cleveland, our partners at the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District are working with us to look at their successful grant program and think about kind of generation 2.0 with it. How can we optimize the existing resource to deliver more benefits? So one of the key things about a grant program, of course, is that by engaging private sector or nonprofit organizations, they're able to build more green infrastructure faster, more efficiently, and cheaper than public agencies probably can. So an interesting model here has been for us is Philadelphia with its Green Acre programs. So we're learning from them and identifying paths that we can leverage outside funds, whether they're private sectors or other grant-making entities, to develop green infrastructure in Metro Cleveland. Janet, I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right. So a little bit about grant programs in general. A lot of utilities, municipalities throughout the United States have implemented green infrastructure grant programs, and they can vary significantly. Grant programs, as opposed to other types of market incentives, such as rebates, for example, are a little bit different. We typically define them as, they fund larger projects, more complex, they're kind of site-specific design. As Jeff said, grant programs can save utilities a lot of money. Implementing projects on private property has been shown to be a lot cheaper for utilities. Grant programs, because they're site-specific and kind of customized projects, they're well suited to a range of property types and different partners. Most programs have more successfully incentivized green infrastructure projects at kind of existing sites, so green infrastructure retrofits, rather than through new or redevelopment sites. So this is a little bit different than the credit trading market. This is because grant programs typically take a little longer, contracting details, those types of things. They don't always fit well with the development process, the timeline of the development process. Although in the context of Northeast Ohio, and Jeff mentioned the Philadelphia example, we're really trying to use grant programs to get projects on the ground to make substantial kind of water quality gains. But grant programs can also provide important educational benefits, and a lot of utilities have seen this, through big, large demonstration projects. They can also be designed to focus on high priority areas and leverage co-benefits and even funding sources associated with those co-benefits. Go ahead.
So, grant programs can be so cost effective and deliver multiple benefits. Why aren't they adopted more widespread? Well, there's the obvious challenge of having a revenue stream to fund a grant program. But on top of that, you look kind of out across the community, it's harder for grants or applicants or potential green infrastructure partners to develop the resources, the expertise of the funds to take on that initial risk associated with the upfront cost of outreach, of initial design, of applying for the grant. And this is particularly true when you're dealing with underprivileged neighborhoods or communities. So there's also some legitimate concerns about the long-term operations and maintenance of grant-funded projects. So we need to assure functionality, but who's really responsible for paying for that maintenance? Are there qualified contractors? Or what happens when properties are transferred or sold? And there's an understandable reluctance for property owners to sign on to really long-term, open-ended maintenance agreements. There's a lot of coordination that has to happen across city departments, and that's not always easy. Permitting maybe in one jurisdiction and funding in another, and coordination across those requires some institutional pathways that may be needed to develop. And finally, before I switch it back over to Janet, I would just say that there's some real or perceived legal barriers about the use of public dollars to fund projects that benefit private property. And those have been largely resolved in many areas, but it's an issue that does come up from time to time. Janet, you want to talk to us about the NEORSD program?
Sure. So as Jeff mentioned, we're working with the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District to think about their version 2.0. So they have a relatively successful grant program. It's been in place for about 4 years, an annual budget of up to $2 million. Until recently, it was only open to nonprofit organizations, community development corporations, and member communities. Northeast Ohio serves about 64 communities. It's open to all types of properties. It can incentivize or be used at new and redevelopment sites, but most projects have been at existing kind of retrofits. The grant program is designed to kind of on an annual basis, so there's an annual application process. But you can see in that text box there, just some stats from 2015. They spent $1.75 million on 11 projects, and the amount of capture, the cost to the district was only about 24 cents per gallon of stormwater volume kind of managed or removed from the system. And that, if you're familiar with costs of managing stormwater on a per gallon basis, is very, very low. You typically, $3 a gallon is not uncommon. So point is, saves them a lot of money by leveraging the private sector and private property. Go ahead.
So in our efforts to update the program, we've recognized that there are different perspectives, right? The district has these categories of challenges, and the public community who is applying for these grants or developing grant-worthy projects has other concerns. So clearly, bridging the funding gap is difficult for applicants, and as a result, there are resource shortfalls that delay projects or frustrate their completion. That's something that the district is trying to resolve. On the other hand, private sector is seeing an opportunity for aggregation where bundling small projects might create an opportunity to bring a pool of funding together and work across a neighborhood scale. There's uncertainty on both sides and whether the projects can be developed and delivered by applicants. So at the same time, there's uncertainty on the applicant side about how permitting delays may frustrate the completion of projects. Maintenance comes across both things. We touched on this earlier. Like the district is, of course, very interested in making sure that projects that it funds are adequately maintained to develop that long-term benefit. On the other side, project proponents and applicants are concerned about how they'll be able to deliver that continual benefit. Shanna, should we walk through this list of things that we're thinking about?
Sure. So you have a little background on what the project looks like. More of a traditional grant program. Jeff talked about some of the barriers and what they're facing in trying to get more projects on the ground, expand the program a bit. So this is kind of a laundry list of focus areas that we're looking at. The first of which is kind of a concept taken from the city of Philadelphia, or the Philadelphia Water Department, known as what they call project aggregation. And this basically is allowing people to develop multiple projects, whether it's kind of a neighborhood scale project, a streetscape, or a bunch of church parking lot retrofits, and bundling those projects or aggregating those projects into one grant program application, with the idea that there's kind of economies of scale. What has happened in Philadelphia, it's starting to kind of inspire small businesses to step up and take on this role. So it's kind of an economic development benefit, and saves money for the district in the end by reducing administrative costs. Another thing we're looking at in Northeast Ohio is how to better leverage, and they actually already do a good job of this, but there's some steps to even further improve how they leverage partnerships and agencies and resources of organizations that have a lot of interest in green infrastructure, not only for stormwater management, but for some of those co-benefits it provides, like neighborhood revitalization. Those organizations are very interested and have a lot of capacity to bundle projects, implement projects, identify projects, and otherwise participate in the grant program. So we're working closely with those to find out resource needs and think about how the district can better leverage those relationships. A third thing, and then I'll pass it up to Jeff, is thinking about how to learn from other cities that have successfully leveraged the private sector to participate in their incentive programs. In Onondaga County, for example, which is located in New York, for their grant program, they actually market the program to private sector consultants who then kind of turn around and find potential projects. So they're kind of almost a sales force for their grant program, and they help to identify good quality projects. So we're thinking about how that model might play out in Northeast Ohio. Jeff?
As we think about this real emphatic need to ensure that green infrastructure projects deliver benefits over time and that they're properly maintained, one of the tasks we've tried to, or challenges we've tried to solve over the years is how do we engage with community organizations and workforce development programs to stand up and sustain the landscaping skills and other skills that are located within the community to provide that functionality. So, along with our kind of community development corporations or other associations, organizations within the city of Cleveland and its surrounding metro area, the concept could be to build partnerships across not just the green infrastructure providing community, but also the job training, the workforce development, the community development community to provide that long-term maintenance. Another thing that's really interesting in Cleveland is a mapping project that a partner organization, a fellow organization, is undertaking that uses GIS-based approaches to identify specific targeted opportunities, not for green infrastructure projects that deliver multiple benefits, whether it's shade or transportation connectivity or other meeting other community goals. So one challenge for us is to layer that as a tool or a technique for ensuring that grant program investments not just deliver the district's interest, which is in stormwater volume control and CSO reduction, but can also provide these additional values to the community. And at the same time, prioritize the partnerships and the potential other funding streams that are associated with those benefits to expand on the pool of resources available for the grant program. We're also really considering programmatic changes, and the district's already pioneering some of these as well, to reduce those initial barriers, the initial upfront risk for taking on grant-ready projects. And then Janet and I have been puzzling over how we can line this up with redevelopment and new development. As she mentioned earlier, the timelines don't really sync too well, but there are steps that we can take to try to engage the development community and link their processes with the district's process for funding green infrastructure projects. So let's go back to our frame. How does the iterative and optimized grant program that we're working with the district to develop meet the 4 challenges we laid out at the beginning? Obviously, we're looking at ways where green infrastructure grants can be more cost effective, deliver more benefits for each dollar that's invested, but also bring in additional sources of funding, so expanding solutions for those economic challenges. By developing more cost effective or more affordable green infrastructure solutions, we're putting more of those projects in the ground, or the district will be able to, which will help them meet their CSO control and permit needs, but also achieve investments that go across the community by bringing in additional funders, additional partners, and the resources and skills that community associations can bring to the table. And again, this distributed green infrastructure contributes to resiliency in the face of more severe, more frequent rain events and future uncertainty. Janet, this is your favorite diagram.
Thank you. Yeah, so just to wrap up, I've through other research, I've been able to look at a lot of different types of programs, incentive programs across the country. And we often give examples of large communities, often DC and Philadelphia are held up as examples for good reason. But it also, I think, frustrates some people, we're not there yet, what can we do? And I think, one key takeaway is that, yeah, those are great models and they have a lot more money than a lot of communities. But there are approaches that smaller communities, mid-sized communities can take. And it's all about kind of understanding where you are, identifying your potential, your partners, your opportunities, and kind of leveraging those in the best way that makes sense for your community. So I think it's a great opportunity to be innovative within different sizes of communities and different circumstances. So that's kind of a key takeaway message. And I think with that, we'll open it up to questions. And again, feel free to contact us. And after today, we're happy to talk to you anytime.
Thank you
These
both.
webinars are a great opportunity to throw a lot of information at people in a short time. So we thank you for giving us a chance to rush through this with you, and would love to take questions and comments.
Great. Thank you, Janet and Jeff, both. We do have a number of questions, and I encourage people to, if you do have other questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box, and we'll get to them. So first question is about the credit trading program and whether or not there's a role for third-party investors who might, for example, provide upfront funds to do the work that could be then reimbursed and could then be reimbursed through the credit sales. Is that part of the model? Is there a role for a third party there?
Yes. That's for sure.
I think we're both rushing to say yes.
Yes, that is definitely a key part of it. something that we didn't really go over is that's kind of a next step in our kind of program development is identifying who those potential investors might be. They do have those in DC, and even in Philadelphia, as I mentioned with the grant program, they have aggregators who are investing upfront funds and then getting reimbursed by the city. But it's definitely a key way to keep the market kind of fluid and working. Jeff, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, one of the challenges Grand Rapids faces, right, is it doesn't have revenue from a stormwater fee to provide that additional kind of reimbursement to private sector aggregators. So the return on investment will really depend on the price of the credit in the market. And while we've done initial kind of calculations about what that'll look like, that's just a location by location factor that's going to be something for the investment community, for the aggregator community to evaluate.
Great. So then we have some questions about maintenance and the sort of how either of these models think about maintenance. So in the grant model, do the grants include funding for maintenance to ensure that you're going to get a good establishment of the green infrastructure? Or are there any requirements around the grantees having some sort of maintenance training or commitment or reporting requirements?
So the district's grant program now requires grant recipients to sign a maintenance agreement for long-term O&M. There aren't additional funds from the district through the grant program that are associated with that. So it is a challenge that's perceived, I think, by both sides of the community. One of the things we're wrestling with in the way to address that, as I mentioned, are there are workforce development and job training programs that have their own standalone sources of funding that can be brought to bear to provide that capacity. Making that connection happen is something we have still yet to work out. Janet, do you want to talk about maintenance in the credit trading context?
Sure. Well, just one thing to add with the district grant program, it's also a part of their scoring matrix is they score based on, they have to include, applicants have to include a maintenance plan in their application, and that goes into the scoring, their ability to actually maintain it. And the district is also looking into, like Jeff said, training programs, one of which is the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program, which is a maintenance green infrastructure job program, certification program being rolled out by the Water Environment Federation as one kind of avenue from ensuring trained workers. On the credit trading side, the maintenance burden, I guess, switches from the maintenance burden switches from the developer who would have had to implement controls on site to the credit generator. So they have to kind of certify, over a given time period. In DC, the credits last 3 years, and they have to kind of recertify after 3 years. They're inspected and things are maintained. That is a burden on the city, but they would also have to inspect those sites, at the development site if they were implemented on site.
A key feature of the credit trading program is that it requires purchase of an annual supply of credits rather than a one-time pay and you're done approach. And that annual purchase, whether it's done in 1-year blocks, 3-year blocks, or 5-year blocks, feeds into the credit generator's ability to provide that long-term maintenance, which then links up with the certification that Janet just described.
So sticking with the sort of maintenance theme, can you talk a little bit more about the kinds of projects that got grants in Cleveland, and if sort of what were the projects, and then what was the maintenance model for those projects? I don't know if you know those details.
Sure. Well, most of the projects that have been implemented have actually been they've been implemented by community development corporations, other nonprofit organizations. They typically range about $200,000 to $250,000, so they're larger projects. Many are also implemented in partly in the public right-of-way. The applicant is responsible for maintaining them. To date, they haven't, well, they have had some problems with maintenance. And they haven't had, I guess, a working model that's been successful. So the applicant is on the hook for maintenance, but it doesn't always shake out that way, that it actually is maintained properly.
Can you talk about when you were looking at the work in Ohio, what led you towards, or what led them towards, a grant program? Did they consider a credit trading framework, or like what was the history of that choice there in terms of how they ended up with a grant program?
Good question. I can take this, Jeff, and you can chime in.
Yeah.
In Northeast Ohio, the scenario is a little bit more complicated for a credit trading program because they do have 64 member communities. And so, you could have trading within each of those communities, or, it's just a little bit more complicated, I guess. Mm-hmm. And they did not initially.
To clarify, because they are a regional authority, and in Grand Rapids, you're dealing with the city?
Yes.
Correct.
So in Northeast Ohio, it's a much larger area with potentially different requirements across communities. Most of them are consistent, but it's a much bigger lift. Their grant program initially started as part of, they have a combined sewer area that falls mostly within the city of Cleveland. And it was designed to complement their CSO, combined sewer overflow reduction efforts in that area to remove volume from the system. I think they recognized that it was a more cost-effective way to get green infrastructure projects on the ground on private property than it was in the public right-of-way.
And can you just, I don't remember if you said this or not, but can you just remind us, how old is the program in Grand Rapids and the grant program in Cleveland? How long have they been going on?
So there is the credit trading program in Grand Rapids is a new approach that we're developing in partnership with the city. It doesn't currently exist.
Okay.
That will, if we roll it out, if we're able to develop this, we'll roll it out the time that the new MS4 permit is issued.
But
Janet,
the Cleveland grant program exists.
Correct. Janet, you're the expert on that. What's the?
It was actually started, I want to say, back in 2009 with demonstration projects. So they kind of rolled it out slowly. They funded a few projects and kind of increased. They really rolled it out in 2014 up to the kind of $2 million level. They kind of built from 2009 to 2014. They would add, slowly projects over time. And now it's fully funded at that $2 million level.
And in either one of these examples, are there requirements that the projects that are funded be implemented within the same watershed or within the municipal boundary, or what are there geographic requirements about implementation?
No, the NEOSD's grant program is open to applicants across the district's service area.
Within the
within the CSO area, not within the MS4 area, although that's a subject of some discussion. Within the city of Grand Rapids, Janet touched on this a little bit earlier, but there are different sewer sheds that follow old creek sheds within the city. And the concern is, obviously, in reducing flooding and stormwater impacts into each of those creek sheds. Our response to this kind of tension between having a unitary market that would be trading all across the city and the need to meet these local flooding and water quality concerns is to develop three market areas that correspond to kind of clumpings of those creek shed areas. But again, this is an evolving project. It's a concept that has not yet been rolled out. It's the shape that it currently has as part of our work with the city of Grand Rapids.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question about the DC program. And can you just clarify, did they require an annual purchase of credits? And does this, is that discouraging to developers? Or is it a one-time system? Just a little confusion about the details of the DC program.
It is technically an annual purchase, so it's not a one-time thing. However, developers who are purchasing credits can enter into multi-year contracts with credit generators, if that makes sense. So they can say, I'll purchase 3 years worth of your credits. I heard recently at a conference that they're trying to encourage, and developers would like this because it provides more certainty for them. They're trying to encourage longer buying periods. Usually it's about 3 years. They're trying to encourage developers and credit generators to enter into longer term contracts.
Makes sense. We have just a comment to look at Chattanooga, Tennessee, that also has some sort of stormwater credit trading model.
Yes.
Do you know about that program?
We do, and we've spoken with them. They haven't. Well, as of last time we had spoken to them, they had not yet had any trades, and there were a number of things that occurred that prevented the market from functioning, fully functioning. They had some last-minute permit changes, and one of the things that they also said was that they didn't have that initial supply of credits built up, and so there was when they rolled out the market, there was nothing to purchase.
Mm-hmm. So you're learning from their experience in Grand Rapids.
We are.
And then a question about integrating green infrastructure I think under either one of these models into playgrounds or parks or other sort of public amenities.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I touched kind of briefly and flitted over street trees as one benefit or one associated kind of line of investment. But bringing in parks to provide funding for playgrounds or ball fields or other recreational facilities that can be multifunctional to provide actual stormwater benefits can fit really nicely with either a grant program or a credit trading program.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we are, I think, basically at time, and let me just take the last 2 minutes to say thank you to everyone who joined us today, and remind you that we are recording this and it will be posted up on the Mayor's Innovation Project website, which is mayorsinnovation.org, and to also say thank you to Janet and Jeff for sharing this information with us today. It's always interesting for us to hear about innovative ways that cities are moving forward on green infrastructure and on financing. And if we're able to hear about both at once, that's fantastic. You see here on your screen contact information for both Jeff and Janet. They have generously offered to answer any follow-up questions. So if we didn't get your question today, please do follow up with them. And is it okay, Janet and Jeff, if we share this presentation in a PDF form as well?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Great, so we'll make that available on our website as well for anybody who's interested. And again, that's mayorsinnovation.org. So one more thank you very much to everyone for listening today, and to Janet and Jeff for presenting. And I hope that folks from cities will tune into the content at mayorsinnovation.org. We do a fair amount of work on water issues, and also, of course, to the great work that American Rivers does. And keep Janet in mind if you have consulting needs. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to stop the recording and finish out unless Janet or Jeff, you have any final words.
No, just a great thank you to the Mayor's Innovation Project for hosting this, and to all of you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.